They say some moments haunt you forever. Some moments change you so deeply, you can never go back to who you were before. It's been 2 years since that night, 2 years since everything in my life twisted into something I still don't know how to explain. I still ask myself, was it my fault? It started with a look. Just a look. But sometimes, that's all it takes. I wasn't supposed to see it. I wasn't supposed to feel anything. But I did. That was the moment everything shifted. I remember it like it was yesterday. The way the air felt different, thicker, charged, like something unspoken was hanging between us. The way my breath caught in my throat when I realized what was happening. The way my stepson's eyes lingered just a second too long. And the way I didn't look away. I should have looked away. I should have never let it get that far. But let me tell you something about loneliness, it's quiet. It sneaks up on you. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It seeps into the cracks of your life so slowly that by the time you realize how deep you've fallen, it's too late. And that's exactly what happened to me. I wasn't some reckless woman. I wasn't searching for trouble. I was just empty, invisible. A wife who had become more of a shadow than a partner. A woman who had spent years giving and giving and giving, only to be left with nothing but silence in return. And then, one night, my husband's son looked at me in a way no one had in years. Not as his stepmother. Not as some forgotten wife. But as a woman. I know what you're thinking. How could this happen? How could you let it happen? And trust me, I've asked myself those same questions every single day since. But the truth? The truth is never simple. Because when you're drowning, when you've spent years feeling like you don't exist, the smallest touch can feel like a lifeline. And I was drowning. Before I tell you the rest, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been caught in a moment that made you question everything? A moment that made you wonder if you were really you anymore? Let me know in the comments. Because I need to know, am I the only one? And before we go any further, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga for more stories that will leave you questioning everything. Because this is only the beginning. I wish I could say I was happy. That I was living the life I'd always imagined. That I was one of those women who felt cherished, seen, adored by the man she chose to spend her life with. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I felt invisible. I was 38 years old, and I barely recognized myself anymore. I had been married to my husband, Greg, for 8 years. He was successful, driven, always busy, always focused on the next deal, the next promotion, the next thing that would elevate his career. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being part of what mattered to him. At first, I told myself it was normal. People get comfortable, right? Marriages change. The excitement of those early years fades. It happens to everyone. But deep down, I knew this was different. Greg didn't just stop noticing me, he stopped seeing me. There were days when I would stand in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection, trying to remember the last time I felt beautiful. The last time I felt like a woman and not just some afterthought in a marriage that had grown colder than the house we lived in. And that house. God, that house. It was big, too big for how empty it felt. Marble floors, high ceilings, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But it wasn't a home. It was a place where silence stretched across every room, where love felt like an old, faded photograph tucked away in some forgotten drawer. And I spent every day inside those walls, waiting. Waiting for a touch that never came. Waiting for a moment when Greg would look up from his laptop and see me again. Waiting for anything that would make me feel alive. But the thing about waiting is, after a while, you start to wonder if you're just wasting your time. And then, he came home. Ethan, Greg's son from his first marriage. I had known Ethan since he was 11 years old. Back then, he was just a quiet kid with messy hair and a shy smile, someone who mostly kept to himself, always buried in books or video games. I was never really his mother. I was just there, the woman his father married. For years, our relationship was simple, polite, respectful. We coexisted, and that was enough. But then he left for college. And when he came back, something had changed. I saw it the moment he walked through the door. He was taller, broader. His face had lost its boyish softness, replaced with something sharper, more defined. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now, the way he looked at people, the way he looked at me. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Because for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I was more than just a forgotten wife. More than just a shadow in my own home. And I should have ignored it. I should have never let myself feel anything. But when you've been starving for something for so long, even the smallest taste feels like a feast. And that night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his back turned to me, the sound of his steady breathing filling the space between us, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the way Ethan's gaze had lingered a little too long. About the way something inside me had stirred in response. About the way, for the first time in so long, I didn't feel invisible anymore. Greg had suggested the beach trip. I think, in his own way, he was trying. Trying to be the husband he used to be. Trying to prove that we were still a family. But trying isn't the same as being. From the moment we arrived, I knew how it would go. Greg set up his chair in the shade, pulled out his phone, and disappeared into whatever world existed behind that glowing screen. Work emails, business calls, texts from people who needed his attention more than I did. I spread out a towel, sat down beside him, and waited. Waited for him to glance up. Waited for him to reach for my hand, to say something. But he never did. After 20 minutes of silence, I gave up. I walked toward the water, letting the waves lap at my feet, the salty breeze brushing against my skin. I watched other couples laughing, children chasing each other across the sand, women basking in the warmth of the sun while their husbands rubbed sunscreen onto their backs. And I felt it again, that ache, that hollowness inside me. That quiet, gnawing loneliness that never seemed to go away. I reached up, adjusting the strap of my swimsuit. It had loosened slightly, slipping down my shoulder. And that's when I felt it. Eyes on me. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough to see Ethan, sitting on his towel a few feet away, watching me. The moment our eyes met, he looked away, quickly, sharply, like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. But the moment had already happened. I swallowed hard, feeling a heat rise to my skin that had nothing to do with the sun. It was just a look. Just a second. But it was enough. Enough to shift something in the air between us. Enough to set my heart pounding in a way I didn't understand. I turned back toward the water, trying to shake the feeling. But even as the waves crashed around me, I could still feel his eyes lingering. That night at dinner, I noticed it again. The way he looked at me. It wasn't obvious, not to Greg at least. But I could feel it. The way his gaze would flicker toward me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, like I was someone worth listening to. Like I was important. Greg barely acknowledged me, cutting into his steak with one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. But Ethan saw me. And the worst part? I liked it. I liked it too much. I told myself I was imagining it. That it was nothing. That I was reading too much into things, twisting innocent moments into something they weren't. But the problem with lies is, you have to believe them for them to work. And deep down, I didn't believe mine. Because I felt it. Something had shifted. A tension I couldn't name, a current beneath the surface that I wasn't sure I wanted to fight. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. The way his eyes had lingered. The way my heart had reacted. The way my body had betrayed me with that tiny thrill, the one I hated myself for feeling. Was it innocent? Was I just starved for attention? I turned onto my side, staring at Greg's back. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and even. It had been months since he'd touched me. Longer since he'd looked at me the way Ethan had. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the thoughts creeping into my mind. But the next morning, they were still there. I told myself I would act normal. That I would go about my day as if nothing had happened. But small moments kept pulling me back in. At breakfast, Ethan's hand brushed against mine when he passed me the coffee. It was nothing, barely a touch, but I felt it all the way down to my bones. Later, when I stood at the sink washing dishes, I caught his reflection in the window. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't watching TV. He was watching me. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the counter. Why was he looking at me like that? Why was I letting him? I turned around, expecting him to look away. He didn't. For a second, we just stood there. No words, no movement. Just the weight of something neither of us dared to name. And then, just like that, it was gone. He cleared his throat, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. And I stood there, hands still gripping the sink, heart pounding in my chest. Because I knew. This wasn't just in my head. And that terrified me. Greg had been working late more often. At first, he used to apologize. I'll make it up to you. We'll have a weekend together soon. But the apologies faded over time, like everything else between us. Now, he didn't even bother. It was just another night, another dinner eaten in silence, another empty space beside me on the couch, another evening where I was left with nothing but my own thoughts. Except this time, I wasn't alone. Ethan was still home. It had started to happen more and more. Little things. He would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to help even when he didn't have to. He'd sit in the living room when I was reading, pretending to be lost in his phone, but never really looking away. And that night, when Greg called to say he'd be late again, Ethan didn't go to his room like usual. He stayed. The TV hummed in the background, but I wasn't really paying attention. I could feel him beside me. Close. Closer than he needed to be. I didn't know why I hadn't moved to the other side of the couch. I should have. I should have kept that space between us, made it clear that this was just another ordinary night. But I didn't. And neither did he. The conversation started off light, harmless. Movies. School. Plans for the summer. But then he asked it. Are you happy? The question landed like a stone in my chest. I turned to him, forcing a smile. Of course. But he didn't look away. I mean, really happy. Something in the way he said it made my breath catch. There was no judgment in his voice. No accusation. Just quiet understanding. Like he already knew the answer. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to lie. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just looked at him, really looked at him. At the sharp angles of his face, the way his jaw tensed like he was holding something back, the way his eyes searched mine as if he was waiting for me to say what we both already knew. I should have ended it there. Laughed it off. Changed the subject. Gotten up and left the room. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years, someone was asking me if I was happy. And I didn't know how to answer. The next few days, everything felt different. He was around more. Small moments turned into something else, something I couldn't name, something I wasn't ready to admit. When I walked past him in the hallway, his fingers brushed against mine. Not by accident. When I poured myself a glass of wine at night, he joined me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint trace of his cologne. When I spoke, he listened. Really listened. And when I looked at him, he didn't look away. The night it changed, Greg was working late again. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I sat on the couch, watching a movie I wasn't really paying attention to. Ethan sat beside me. Not far. Not close. But enough. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of the TV. The air felt heavy, charged, filled with something unsaid. And then it happened. A scene in the movie, some romantic moment, a couple leaning in close, a kiss hovering between them. I don't even remember what it was about. I only remember what happened next. His hand, brushing against mine. Not by accident. Not like before. And this time, I didn't move away. My heart pounded, my breath shallow, every inch of me screaming that this was wrong. But I didn't pull away. Because in that moment, every lonely night, every cold silence, every time I had begged Greg to see me and been ignored, none of it mattered. None of it existed. There was only this. Only him. Our fingers stayed there, just barely touching. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And in the silence, something shifted. Something I couldn't take back. The night it happened, Greg wasn't home. Another business trip. Another few days of silence, of empty rooms and unanswered calls. I didn't even ask where he was going this time. I stopped caring a long time ago. It was just me and Ethan in the house. And the weight of everything we hadn't said. I couldn't sleep. I had been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the clock ticking in the dark. Tick, tick, tick. Each second stretched, pulling at something inside me, winding it tighter and tighter until I thought I might break. I needed a drink. I threw back the covers, slipping quietly out of bed. My bare feet touched the cold floor, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator as I stepped into the kitchen. I poured a glass of wine. One sip, then another. And then I felt it. That presence. I turned, and there he was. Ethan. Standing in the doorway, watching me. His hair was messy, like he had just woken up, his t-shirt loose around his frame. But it was his eyes that got me. Dark. Searching. Like he knew. Like he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. He didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged. And then, softly, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he said my name. Not stepmom. Not hey. Not the casual way he had always said it before. Just my name. And something inside me shattered. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping me from falling. You should go back to bed, I whispered. But he didn't move. Didn't blink. I can't, he said. His voice was low, rough, like he was holding something back. Why? I asked. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because I can't stop thinking about you. My breath hitched. He stepped closer. Not enough to touch, not enough to cross that final, thin line we had been dancing around for weeks, but enough. Enough to make me feel his warmth. Enough to make my pulse hammer in my throat. This is wrong, I whispered, but my voice wasn't firm. It wasn't convincing. He swallowed, his jaw tight. Then why haven't you walked away? I should have. But I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but stand there as he reached out. Slow, tentative, giving me every chance to stop him, until his fingers brushed against mine. The touch sent a shiver up my spine, my body betraying me in ways I didn't want to admit. My grip tightened on the counter, my knuckles white. Tell me to stop, he murmured. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I didn't want him to. And in that single, breathless second, I knew. There was no going back. Not from this. Not from the way his hand slid up my arm, slow and careful, setting fire to every inch of my skin. Not from the way my heart pounded as his fingers traced the side of my face, tilting my chin up until our eyes met. Not from the way he hesitated, just long enough to give me a choice. But I didn't choose. I didn't move away. And when he finally leaned in, when his lips brushed against mine in the softest, most dangerous kiss of my life, I let him. The second my lips touched his, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It was soft at first. Tentative. His hands gentle, his breath warm against my skin. But there was a moment, a heartbeat, a whisper of time, where everything changed. Where I let it happen. Where my body leaned into his. Where I didn't just allow the kiss, I wanted it. And that realization hit me harder than anything. I yanked myself back so fast I nearly knocked over the wine glass on the counter. My heart was slamming in my chest, my breathing uneven, my mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. His eyes searched mine, dark and unreadable, waiting for me to speak. I couldn't. My voice cracked. I shook my head, stepping back, desperate to create space that suddenly felt non-existent. We can't, I finally whispered. This didn't happen. He didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't try to stop me when I turned and walked away. But I felt his eyes on me the whole time. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything on a torturous loop. The way his touch had set my skin on fire. The way I hadn't pulled away soon enough. The way I had felt wanted for the first time in years. But worst of all, the way I had wanted him back. He wouldn't stay in the same room for too long. Wouldn't meet my eyes when we spoke. Wouldn't respond when I tried to fill the air with small talk. And it was worse than anything I had imagined. Because before, there had been something. Something electric, something alive, something that made me feel like I still existed in this house, in this life. But now, there was only silence. And I hated it. Hated the way I caught myself searching for him. Hated the way I felt his absence like a physical thing. Hated the way it made me wonder if I had ruined something before it even had the chance to begin. Greg noticed. Not all at once. Not in a way that made me panic. But little things. Subtle things. One night, as we lay in bed, he turned to me, his voice quieter than usual. "You seem distracted lately." My breath caught, my fingers tightening around the blanket. "Just tired," I lied. "You sure?" I forced a smile. "Yeah. Why?" He watched me for a second longer than necessary. Then he shook his head. No reason. But something in his tone told me he wasn't convinced. And that terrified me. I should have been relieved that Ethan was pulling away. That whatever this was between us had started to fade before it could destroy everything. But the worst part? It didn't feel like it was fading. It felt like it was waiting. Waiting for the next moment. The next mistake. The next time we would be alone. Because no matter how wrong it was, no matter how much we tried to fight it, this wasn't over. Not even close. What kind of person does this? What kind of woman stands in her own kitchen, feeling the heat of her stepson's gaze, wanting it? What kind of wife lets her body betray her, lets her lips part, lets her breath hitch, lets it happen? I thought I knew myself. I thought I was a good person. But now all I could see was someone else. Someone desperate. Someone weak. Someone who had spent years starving for something real, only to reach for it in the worst possible place. I had ruined everything. Even if Greg never found out, even if nothing ever happened again, I knew. I would carry this secret like a sickness. It would sit in my chest, a knot that would never come undone. It wasn't just the kiss. It wasn't just the way my hands had burned where he touched me. It was the truth beneath it all. That I had wanted it. That I had spent years longing for someone to see me. And when he did, I hadn't turned away. I had leaned in. I had given in. And now there was no undoing it. I tried to move on. Tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that mistakes could be erased if you just pretended hard enough. I cooked dinner. I smiled at Greg. I folded laundry, went grocery shopping, answered emails, went through the motions of a woman who still had control of her life. But I felt him everywhere. Ethan. The way he wouldn't look at me. The way he left the room when I entered. The way he carried himself like he was just as lost, just as guilty. And the way, late at night, when the house was quiet and I was left alone with my thoughts, I still felt the ghost of his touch. I still wanted it back. I was washing dishes when it happened. Greg was in his office. The house was still. And then, suddenly, he was there. Ethan. Standing in the doorway. My hands froze under the warm water. I didn't turn around. Didn't move. I just waited. Waited for him to walk away. Waited for him to pretend, like I had been pretending. But he didn't. We can't pretend it didn't happen. His voice was quiet. But it hit me like a slap. My fingers tightened around the plate in my hands. I swallowed hard. It was a mistake. I said it firmly. I needed him to believe it. I needed me to believe it. He was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. But it wasn't agreement. It wasn't understanding. It was something else. Something that said he wasn't convinced. Something that said this wasn't over. I turned off the faucet, placing the plate in the drying rack with shaking hands. I still didn't look at him. I couldn't. Because if I did, I wasn't sure what I'd see. Or worse, what I'd do. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. That after that moment in the kitchen, I never thought about him again. That I buried my feelings, erased the memory of his touch, and carried on like nothing had happened. But that would be a lie. Because some moments don't fade. Some mistakes don't just disappear. They linger. They stay with you, woven into the quiet spaces of your mind, creeping up when you least expect them. Like a song stuck on repeat. Like a scar you can't stop tracing. Even now, I ask myself, what if? What if I had walked away that night? What if I had never let him look at me that way? What if I had never let myself want it? Would things be different? Would I still be the same woman I was before? Or had I always been this person, this lonely, hollow version of myself, just waiting for someone, to pull me into something I could never take back? I don't have an answer. Maybe I never will. But I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where emotions blurred the lines of right and wrong? Where logic told you one thing, but your heart, your body, told you something else? What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments. Because I need to know, am I alone in this? Or have you felt it too? And before you go, if you want more stories like this, more raw, real moments that will make you question everything, don't forget to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because sometimes the truth isn't just stranger than fiction. It's darker, more dangerous, more real than we want to admit. Loneliness makes people do things they never imagined. It starts as a whisper, a small, aching need. And if you ignore it, if you let it fester long enough, it becomes something else. Something bigger. Something you can't take back. So if you're in a marriage, if you're in a relationship where you feel unseen, unloved, forgotten, don't wait. Don't let it get to this point. Because some mistakes, no matter how much you regret them, you carry forever.